Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on the Dairy Signal. We have a really special episode coming your way as we talk about something that's probably on a lot of people's minds, and especially with spring right around the corner here. And for some of us, we're dead in the middle of it, it feels like, and that is our tiling systems. But before we dive into that here this afternoon, it wouldn't be a Dairy Signal without a little bit of today in history. And today we are taking a step back to 1865 as it was on this day that Robert E. Lee surrendered. And you're probably thinking and scratching your head and what was happening during this time. And you're probably thinking, I know this name, but what does it really mean? And it was because in a Virginian village, Robert E. Lee surrendered his 2,800 or 28,000, excuse me. Big difference there. 28,000 Confederate soldiers to the Union for Ulysses S. Grant, and effectively it ended the American Civil War. So, big day in American history, if you will. But we are not here to talk about American history, as interesting as it can be sometimes. We are here to dive into what's going on in our fields and how can we be maybe a little bit more cognizant and aware and effective with what's going on for tiling. And joining us this afternoon, we have Kevin Erb, who is a program manager and conservation professional training with the Conservation Professional Training Program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Now, Kevin, we're excited to have you on here this afternoon, but would you mind giving a little bit of an introduction about yourself here today?
Sure, definitely can. So I grew up on a small 400-acre beef operation in central Illinois, and been with University of Wisconsin Extension now for over 30 years. Certified crop advisor, and have been dealing with manure management, agronomic issues for that entire time, and do a lot of training of for-hire manure applicators, farmers, and agency staff around agriculture and water quality.
Well, we're excited to have you, as I mentioned, especially as we dive into this topic, because it's something that ultimately is an issue or an area where we have to deal with, whether we like it or not sometimes, and that's tiling. As much as you want to just lay it and let it go, there's some things that always have to be thought about and considered. And I'm going to let you take it away with your presentation here, but I do want to remind folks that if you're watching live, you can ask your questions via Slido to the right of the screen on a desktop device. And if you're on a mobile device, you can scroll on down below and type your questions in there, and we'll take those throughout today's episode. So without further ado, Kevin, I will let you take it away.
Sounds good. So what I'm going to be talking about here over the next half hour or so is really, do we have the ability to find some of those old tile that maybe your dad, your grandpa, or somebody else put in? How do we maintain that, and a few things like that? So I get questions just like you and I, Amber, talked about before we came on the air here. Well, why is this important? And I think it's really important to know where those tile are, because if there is a problem, it makes repairing and upgrading that tile much easier. And as we were talking about as well, we occasionally do have a problem with manure getting into drain tile, particularly when that solids content is less than 2.5%. And should that happen, it's rare, but it does. But knowing where those tile are can really make a difference in keeping a small problem small and preventing a major fish kill. So we think about old tile. Some of these wind back and forth across property lines. Maybe the farm was originally an 80, got split into two 40s. The tile was there beforehand. Sometimes farmers would partner and run tile together. And if you're trying to connect into an existing system, not knowing where it is, the size, can make that investment really not realize its full potential. We also have a number of folks that maybe their older systems are on 50-foot centers, and they're going to go in and split the laterals, put the new ones in halfway in between. And so knowing what's there makes that a whole lot easier as well. And the other thing, that we still find what we call midnight connections. Neighbors sometimes tied into systems in the middle of the night or back behind the hill. A number of times I found barn drains, milk house waste systems going into tile, septic systems from houses that are out in the country, tool shed drains, all sorts of things that may interconnect. And so kind of having a feel for where these are can make finding problems easier and dealing with situations. So another reason is we're expanding our dairy facilities. We're going in sometimes into fields that have previously been corn or alfalfa. and not knowing that we've got drain tile out there can be an issue. So this is a situation from Northeast Wisconsin, what we call the Good Friday incident from more than a decade ago. But this manure storage was put in, and the farmer didn't realize there was drain tile there. After a few years, it began seeping out, and we lost about 250,000 gallons down into that wetland you see at the top of that photo there in about a 12-hour period. And it was a huge hassle and situation to deal with that, to keep it from getting farther downstream. Another situation, this one not involving drain tile, but drain tile pipe used for stormwater. When the barns were built, the roof water was taken out to the road ditch in a 15-inch pipe. And during repairs on the manure storage, that pipe was damaged. It eventually collapsed, manure seeped in. Out of that manure storage, we lost more than 500,000 gallons of manure out of that. And it was a scramble to be able to deal with that. So knowing where any of these underground pipes or drainage systems in are is really important. So we think back, drainage has been around for more than 150 years. In fact, you were talking about Robert E. Lee and Ulysses Grant, and we didn't plan this, Amber, but some of the original drain tile systems were actually hand dug, three-sided wooden logs nailed together. But after the Civil War, they would take cannonballs, attach them to a rod on an ox cart, and you started at the ditch, and you had four guys on there. And as the ox or the horses went into the field, you had four guys turning that crank, so you got that angled pathway for water to go. As recently as 15 years ago, we were still seeing some of these working more than 100 years old in central Wisconsin. We did see them in Illinois, Indiana, some other areas as well. I first ran into these back in, I think, 1988 or 1989, somewhere around there. Then we started seeing the clay tile come in about 1900 or so, and then that evolved to concrete. And right now we're seeing a lot of plastic tile out there. Now, those old clay tile, the concrete tile do break down over time. They may have a life expectancy of 40 to 50 years, but a lot of these have been in for more than 100. And so, particularly as you get southern part of Wisconsin into Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, some of these are still functioning. They're not functioning at the same capacity, but this degradation means that we may have collapses, and we'll see that impact on some yield maps here in a little bit. Now, I mentioned that I grew up on a small farm in central Illinois. These two photos are actually taken on the home farm when the drainage districts were formed in the early 1900s. And these tile were brought in by train. Those are actually, I believe, 26 or 24 inch, if I remember right, but hand dug in, or horses and slip shovels. And so when it's that labor intensive, you only put in what was really essential. And as we've gotten newer technology that's allowed us to trench in tile, to plow it in, it's become much more economical, and we're putting in a lot more. So how do we find that stuff that may be 50, 70, 100 years old? Well, my favorite sources are really to go to some old, and in some cases, some newer air photos. We can use the yield maps off of the combine as well as field observations. We have a few folks playing around with rods and transponders sticking up the tile outfall. There's what I call the Budweiser and Euchre method, and people playing with drones as well. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about has examples from Wisconsin and some surrounding states, but just about anywhere in the country, you're going to be able to find some of those 1930s air photos that were taken by USDA. And some states, they're GIS compatible, other states, they're not. In those states where they have been converted to ortho, you can pull those into your existing GIS system. It's kind of neat to see how things have actually changed over time. The one thing I point out is I look at this and, oh, I can see what looks to be drain tile there. No, those are actually, I believe, either corn or wheat shocks from when corn was more manually harvested. In that pattern in the field, that's sort of those whitish lines that you see there. A lot of times I'm looking at these and I'm saying, well, does this make sense, or is it just how the field was farmed? The darker lines you see in that circle on the right are hand drawn in by the farmer a few years after the tile were put in. And that was their best guess as far as where the tile actually were. So if I look at these two photos, 1930 with a hand drawn on the left and the 1950s on the right, you'll see those whitish lines there in the blue circle on the right. That's where the tile actually is. And these older tile show up because we brought up a lot of that clay subsoil, different color, and so much more visible. You can see the hand-drawn lines on the left, reasonably close, but not enough to be right on top and to match where they are. So some of those older hand-drawns, and my dad has some too, give you a starting point, but they're really not accurate. And so I look at 2010 from that same field in Iowa here, and I can see that darker green there. This is a wetter year, and the corn is much greener and healthier right above that drain tile because the water, the excess water, has actually drained out of the root zone. So how do I find these tile? Well, I like to start, and I need to give credit here to Steve Hoffman of In-Depth Agronomy out of Manitowoc County, Wisconsin. Steve was one of the early innovators that kind of developed some of these techniques and has really moved forward and has a very nice process to help farmers map out drain tile. But what he and I both like to do is start out with those multiple layers of air photos. Now, if you've got ArcGIS or some fancy GIS software, that's fine, but you really don't need it. A lot of times I'll just print out copies of these, put them on the table in good light and start looking at them. I can also put them like in a PowerPoint presentation, flip through and see differences. And we'll talk about Google Earth here as another flip through option as well. So I'm overlaying these and seeing, okay, what differences in soil color, in crop growth am I seeing from one year to the next? And so I'm not able to pick up a lot of these differences in hay fields, but I can a lot of times in corn and early in spring, like right now before the crops get planted, before fields get tilled. Some of these things will show up very nicely. So Google Earth is a free program you can download off of the web, but it does have in there air photos, in some cases going back to the 1980s or earlier. Now, the quality of those older photos is not as good as the more recent ones, but you can flip through and actually look at things. And so I've got two things circled here on the screen. Both of those are where you can find the time machine function. In this case, that one in the lower left is saying that the earliest photo available for this particular farm site is 1992. We're actually looking at the 2015 air photo here on that one. So things are going to show up in some years, but not in others. And so this is an air photo out of Calumet County, Wisconsin, also from Google Earth. And what I'm seeing here are a couple of things. So up here in the right-hand side, north or above this dark green hayfield here, I'm seeing 4 lines running east and west connected to one that goes out by this house. That's probably an old wet spot that got 4 laterals. Very good chance I'm going to find a tile outfall in that road ditch right across the street from that house. If I look over here closer to the railroad, I'm seeing more of a strip pattern, both sides of the railroad right-of-way here. But I'm also seeing areas that are a very light color, almost a sandy color, definitely not sand in this spot. But the reason the tile are showing up very nicely is the soil has dried out a little bit quicker above that drain tile. So in these darker areas where I'm seeing those whitish lines, the soil is dried out above the tile. It's visible for 3 or 4 days in spring. The areas where I'm not seeing anything, a little bit drier soil, maybe a little bit more sand in there. And so there may be tile in there, but this particular year, they're definitely not showing up. And in the upper left-hand corner here, you'll actually see 2 parallel. I believe this was on either side of a waterway, and that waterway is no longer there, but you can see where the drain tile actually are. So conditions to pick this up in a photo from a drone or an airplane or a satellite, maybe 3 or 4 days each year, usually as things start to warm up and dry out in the spring. So we're getting into that window where I can send the drone up and be able to pick up some of these things here as well. So sometimes you get lucky on the air photos. This is one out of Iowa, and in the left and upper right here is one out of Western New York, I believe in the Ottawa area. But sometimes you either are right on after the drain tiles are installed, or in the case of the New York one here, during the installation itself. And so you can use some of the GIS tools that are available for free out there to more precisely mark where some of these are if you get this lucky. So here we have 3 different years for the exact same farmstead and fields in Calumet County, Wisconsin. In that upper left one there, really not seeing anything. If I look in the one on the upper right, on the field to the right there, I can see where the tile are that went to a couple of wet spots, but that green alfalfa field on the left, not seeing anything there. If I go down to the window, the air photo at the bottom, there I'm seeing some really interesting things. So first thing, straight south of that farmstead, I can see that grid tile pattern in the field. Once again, a wet year, the corn is much greener and healthier above that drain tile. I can pick it out fairly easily. But I also have that curving area to the right there that is completely green, and that matches to that lighter, drier soil in the photo in the upper right. So soil conditions, type of soil, drainage has a real impact on how healthy that corn crop actually is. So like I said, it's the soil moisture differences. Dry soil warms up more quickly, and that warmth is one of the reasons why infrared photography, which we'll talk about in a couple of moments here, can sometimes pick up some of these as well. So these are a couple of pictures out of, once again, New York. The one on the right is an air photo, and it's a very interesting tile pattern here north of that white roof tool shed. And if I start looking on the left, and it's a little bit hard to see, but I can see the north and south drain tile lines in here that match up very nicely with what I have in the air photo. But then I'm also seeing a darker area here as well. And that actually doesn't match up with drain tile, but that's more compaction because of driving in and out of the field from the field driveway. So once again, not everything that you think maybe tile is, which is why I like to overlay an infrared with the satellite photos with the yield monitor data. So here's a couple of images out of Champaign County, Wisconsin. Champaign County, Illinois is one of the first to do infrared photography, actually back in the 70s to start trying to find drain tile. But the photo on the left here does show a couple of red areas in this main field on the right that show these little bit drier, warmer areas. Infrared will sometimes pick up different vegetation as well. So it's not precise for tile, but it does give us one piece of information. And then based on that, the County Soil and Water Conservation District was able to create the tile map you see on the right by combining all of these different sources together. So there's paid subscription services out there, but I like to start with the free ones. So one of the nice free ones is your county property tax authority. A lot of times the county GIS systems will have multiple years of air photos. Zoom in on a field, you can flick through them and kind of see things. We've got our online maps, Bing, Google Earth, Web Soil Survey. They claim to all be using the same imagery, but they will tend to pick what they think is the nicest. And so I've had one field where I'm looking for the exact same year, and each of those has 3 different photos, and it's really neat to be able to see things. And then the state cartographer's office in each state may have some as well. So starting in the 1930s, 1940s, USDA began doing annual airplane flights over the agricultural areas, taking photos. The more recent ones do include infrared. A lot of those are online. If you're in Wisconsin, you can use that Real Earth server to look at the what's called the NAIP or NAPE imagery. And you can flip through several years. I think they've got every other year for about a decade on there. It's a very nice resource. The other thing I found is a lot of our NRCS field offices, land and water, soil and water conservation districts may actually have some of the old maps on file that they helped design systems, because prior to 1985, the agencies were actively involved in helping farmers drain tile. And so some of their old maps still exist as well. So we think about those county GIS websites. This one is Hardin County, Ohio. There's just a link on the homepage to view area GIS maps. That's really what you're looking for. This is a very nice one outside of Ada, Ohio. And you can see these whitish lines on here. The drain tile systems, the year this was taken, showed up very well. But if I look at a different year, which is that map in the lower left, I'm not seeing hardly anything at all. So just another illustration of 3 years apart, just not taken at the right time for these to show up. Here's an example out of Wood County. And I just brought this one in because there's a field in the center here that at first glance, yeah, that looks like drain tile. No, it's actually the residue left from combine when the soybeans were harvested that has a similar type of pattern. So I'm kind of looking at things like this, the headlands, and for what matches my typical tillage pattern across the field. Here's another one out of Jefferson County, Wisconsin. A couple of areas I've got circled here that do show some of those drain tile beginning to peek through. One out of Outagamie County, once again, in this case, it's showing up quite nicely in some fields, but this wheat field down here at the bottom, I know these lines go into that field, but they're not showing up. So then you can throw in the low-level drone or the other imagery. Wet and dry years can be good. This is a wet year with a colleague of mine who used to fly an ultralight, and he went up in a wet year and just started photoing fields, and I can see these strips running across the fields here. That is the nicer, greener, healthier corn above the drain tile. And so it's obvious here that that tile may be 6 inches in diameter, but the effect is several rows of corn wide throughout that field. I can also see the pale yellow color where the corn doesn't have as much nitrogen and isn't quite as healthy. Field observations are helpful as well. So the field on the left here, cornfield, and about 100 feet beyond where the photographer is standing, I can see that dark green strip there where the drainage is better. Now, in some years, if I'm tiling a spring and it's dry, that may actually be taller and healthier. And so it depends on the year what you're going to see. The one on the right here is actually an alfalfa field out of Brown County, Wisconsin. This was taken during a very wet year, and you can see the alfalfa is growing much healthier above that tile, but in a very narrow pattern compared to 15, in some cases 20 foot wide above the corn. Once again, corn roots tend to go more laterally. Alfalfa tends to be taprooted.
So quick question here, Kevin. I know we're going through some of these field observations, but we had a question that came in from a listener. And it's good in this discussion point because I think it goes to show that, especially when it comes to what we're talking about here today, there's not just one answer and it's a lot of detective work.
Yep.
Because it reads, what if you aren't quite as lucky and the photos that you have are very limited or not just taken in the right condition? And it reads, what options then to help find majority? And I think field observations is a really good place to add this question because it can add to the discussion of, you got to be looking for it. So aside from seeing some differences, and these photos are really helpful in that, in terms of what's growing, but what if you aren't quite in that growing stage? And I see we've got a photo more on the right here that might lead to a good answer to this question.
Yep. And so we'll talk about yield maps and some of the other technology a little bit later on, but this is an excellent place, Amber, to stop me in the presentation here, because the photo on the right, I can see what appears to be that drier area that heads straight towards that house. And the reason I have this photo in here is twofold. One is it's an example of what some of these drier spots may look like on the ground. And this is one area where I'd really like to get some more photos, but my timing is never good to go out sometimes and catch the right days and shoot some of these. But the other reason I have this in here is that tile is shooting directly for that house. I would pretty much bet money that either the septic system or the downspouts from the rain gutters are connected to that drain tile. Um, and so this is one situation where um, I would be careful with what I'm doing, obviously, knowing that there is the potential that digging into that, I might find something that I don't want to find. In fact, it was probably just over, probably a little bit more than a decade ago. I'm feeling old here, Amber, but was on a site where we had drain tile that was growing full of a sewage fungus because of all the nutrients. Well, there was a leaking manure storage that was contributing nutrients. There was a second farm that had the drain from their milk house parlor that went into that tile, and a third house where their septic system was plumbed into that same farm drain tile system. And we're standing at the road ditch, and yeah, we've got bits of toilet paper coming out into the road ditch. I've got milk house waste twice a day coming out there, and I know that this manure storage is contributing as well. And so if you don't have good photos, and not everybody does, that's when those field observations, and we've all got phones with cameras that geolocate to within a few feet of where I am. When I'm out in the field, I see a tile blowout. That's an indication there's a tile there. I take a picture and it perfectly geolocates it. You're out in the field, you see something like this, take a few photos, walk to a couple of different spots, right over that field with an ATV. Like to get in the field, it's a little bit too wet, too cool here in the next few months. Get on the UTV and start driving across fields and see what you see.
I mean, it's very interesting to think about because there's lots of options and opportunities. It's just a matter of there is some work you got to put into in order to get the results you're looking for.
Right. And I've been very lucky in being able to find some really good air photos for this presentation. There are other spots in the counties I've worked in where I've not been able to find a single photo that shows anything. And so it's the luck of the draw. In fact, one of the sites that I want to do a little more investigation on, I know there's tile there. I've never found anything, and happened to be looking at a neighboring county's air photos that overlap just across the county line, and there showed what I was looking for. So looking at these multiple sources, go to Bing Maps, go to Google Maps, go to Web Soil Survey, go to your county GIS website. Just start making a list of all those different sources. Talk to your crop consultant, see what the agencies, FSA, NRCS have in their files for your particular farm. There's particularly with the newer technology out there, I know there's satellite services you can subscribe that'll do daily photos. Maybe you see if they've got something.
That's very interesting. And I'll let you continue on here because I know we got more to get to, but it's definitely an interesting thing to be thinking about and options.
Yep. And I mentioned those tile blowouts. Here's just a couple of examples. One of my favorite things to do if I run across these, like I said, grab my cell phone, take some photos. It's perfectly geolocated. The GPS within your phone, if you don't have a cellular signal, is within 15 feet. If you've got cellular service, it's even more accurate sometimes. And there's an app out there called What3Words that will refine it and get you down to within a 10 square foot area. That's a free app. It's one that I like using. And interestingly, it's called What3Words because it's taken the entire surface of the planet, divided it into small segments, and by typing 3 random words that they're randomly assigned, you can go to that exact same spot without having to remember a lat long or type in this long web address. So there are some neat tools out there that are available for free for folks. But one of the things I mentioned a moment ago was yield maps. And so this is one, and this is really where Steve Hoffman's work has been groundbreaking on this, is really starting to look at yield maps as a source of figuring out where drain tile actually are. And just a caveat, of course, not every difference you see in a yield map is drainage, but it does help us isolate some patterns in the field. And so just a couple of examples of how yield maps are being used. So I look at the black lines on the map here. These are spots where we know we've got tile, and so we've overlaid those with a yield map from a wet year. And what you'll see fairly quickly is those green areas pretty much overlay where I've got known drain tile. And so that's what we're seeing here. But in that upper left-hand corner, that top arrow of that field there, I've got green strips in that field, but I don't have tile marked. So my gut feeling here is that, yeah, if I go out there and start probing with a tile probe, start looking, I'm going to see old tile that nobody has mapped in those green strips. We saw earlier those air photos about how those strips were darker green, healthier. Here we're seeing that in terms of the yield. And so if you remember some of those drone photos, or not drone, but ultralight, the very center of those darker green areas you could see was taller. And so that's one way you can kind of go out and get a handle on where some of these unknown tile may actually be. The other thing that I like about kind of this overlay is the bottom two arrows here. So the bottom two arrows show where I've got known tile that's going through red areas or very low yielding areas. And so what this is telling me is the tile is collapsed. I've got a partial plug. Maybe it wasn't installed properly. I don't have the right slope, but this is where I'm pretty sure I could get a nice yield boost by going in and repairing or replacing that tile in those spots. So you don't always get a nice perfect map like this. This is the ideal example, but you can use things like this to be able to figure things out. I mean, I'm looking in this upper right-hand corner here. I have a tile that goes so far, it's green and yellow, and suddenly it turns red. Would not be surprised if there's an unworking or collapsed tile in that red area. It's a matter of kind of getting out there with the backhoe, the tile probe, and just start seeing what you can find. You can also use the topographic maps and the LiDAR maps to find some things as well. The three arrows here are intermittent streams that used to be there, but when the drainage district came into play, they buried a large tile there, and those intermittent streams no longer exist. But the fact they're a low place in the landscape, they were there at one time, to me says I probably have some fairly good sized mains running down in these low areas. Probably not at the very lowest point of the landscape, but very close either side to that low point. And so these are not probably going to show on an air photo because they're larger mains, which means they're buried deeper. So you're not going to see as much of a difference sometimes from the air photos. But you need to start digging out there. So once you have all of these sources, that's where I like to say start building your map. I always like to see folks color code by source so they can go back and, oh, I could see this on air photo. I've got this gap. Maybe I go back to that same air photo, look again. And I always like to do the entire square mile. If you don't have the time to do that, at least do every field adjacent to yours, because having that can help you figure out things in terms of, well, is my system undersized? Are my neighbor's tiles feeding into this? All of those types of questions. Always like to see people include where those tile outfalls are. I know a number of our listeners are permitted dairy farms, and in some states they're required to monitor drain tile during and after manure application. So having the map of where those are can be very helpful. I've spent the better part of an afternoon walking a stream trying to find tile outfalls, and I can't. So anytime you've got one, GIS map it, take a photo with your phone, document it, document where those inlets are, and any other features. And if I've got a blowout, I like to document that as well, because if I'm consistently blowing out in the same field, that means I've either got a pressure problem, either too much water, I've got not enough air being able to get in there, or I've got a design issue that I need to fix. And of course, there's always the Budweiser Euchre method, going down to the co-op where the retired farmers are playing cards, take some old air photos down and see what they remember. I've been very successful doing this in the past. You get some of the older farmers talking, oh, I remember when so-and-so did this, or this happened, and doing that, or talking to the retired tile contractor, take them a 6-pack of their favorite brew and ask them if they've got any maps or what they remember as well. So to wrap up here, we'll talk briefly about some other technologies like ground penetrating radar and transponders. So ground penetrating radar has been used farther south, Illinois, Iowa, Indiana. There's two challenges to using it. One is it's not as effective in our high calcium soils. So our high pH soils, it's really not as effective. The other thing is if I've got rocks, it's going to pick up rocks. And so the image we have here has several different drain tile that are mapped, but I also have a few other things that look like they could be drain tile, but they're actually not. This one on the left here, the second question mark from the left, directly above the tile, I suspect that when they buried that tile originally, some rocks got brought up, and that's what's showing up closer to the surface. But without digging out there, I don't know. People are talking about ground penetrating radar, but I really have not seen in Wisconsin in particular, it be very cost effective. We can also thread a rod with a transponder up through either at a blowout or the outfall and map it that way. That distance is limited. If you're going to pay a tile contractor or a sewer contractor to do that, spend the extra money and have them use one that has a camera attached. One that I was involved with here just about a month and a half, 2 months ago, we went up the pipe, and about 50 feet from where we thought there was a problem, we actually saw the top of the clay tile had shifted downward. Well, it turns out that a contractor had buried fiber optic cable, and their equipment had actually shifted the tile downward in that one particular spot. So we got a sag, and that's why we were getting sediment and stuff filling up in that spot in the tile. So to kind of summarize, why do we spend the time and the money to map out the tile? Well, number one, it's going to make those repairs easier. If we know where it is, we know that we can see a yield benefit by fixing those problems. It's a lot better than going out there and digging that 300-foot long backhoe trench. And I've been on a number of those sites as well. Makes adding in or tying into some old systems easier. Although, like I said, a lot of our tile has that 40 to 60-year life and needs to be completely replaced at this point. So with that, we'll wrap up here, and that gives us plenty of time for any questions that may have come in.
So, Kevin, we have a question that came in from a listener, and I think it's a really good and interesting question. So I'm curious your opinion here, because it reads, going back to the house and house sewage and milk house drainage discussion that you had, what do you do, especially if it impacts not just you, but your neighbor? Who is responsible? And that's the million-dollar question right there.
Yeah, it really is, because it depends on where you are in the country and the local rules. But most of our states and counties have requirements in place that a septic system be functional. And quite honestly, a lot of the connections predate those ordinances, those laws, and those requirements. And so it's the same type of a situation in some cases that I've seen where somebody wants to go across a neighbor's land to outlet into a stream rather than discharge in the road ditch. And that is that sometimes you approach it and say, hey, let's split the cost on this because it's going to be beneficial to me. And the example of crossing the neighbor's land, if you wanted to pay, I'll pay for the initial cost, but if you wanted to go up another 2 inches in tile size so you can tie into it in the future, if you want to pay that additional incremental amount, that's fine. A lot of it depends on the relationship that you have with that homeowner, because realize that the moment you say there's a problem here, that may be an unexpected $10,000, $20,000 bill for them to create a working septic system. Or in some cases, their house may not have the right soils to even do any type of on-site septic system. They have to go to a holding tank with that ongoing cost. So there's no magic solution. A lot of it's personal relationships, but also understanding that, yeah, they're contributing to a problem in your tile, but you got to be careful because it's going to be a very expensive fix for that neighbor.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those situations you don't want to find yourself in, that's for sure. But as we're thinking about what we can do now, whether you're, thinking about maybe I should start, figuring out where some of this old tile is at, or I've got some time before I think anything has to really be done. And we all say that with a knock on wood type of situation, because the moment we think that way, it all goes to hell in a handbasket. But with all that being said, if you have time and the luxury of time on your side, what are some of the first steps you would take to really think about it this season, this time of year, knowing that you have maybe the ability to watch the plants grow and see what's happening with that, but what would you do now, today, or maybe in the next month or two on those side of things?
So I think in the short term, if you have fields where there's tile, as we get into some of these warmer days here, before we really start getting into corn planting and soybean planting, go out there with the ATV, go out there with the drone every couple of days and look for those spots in the field where you already know or suspect they're tile. See if you can pick up any differences in the soil moisture, in that soil color, and start documenting those. And then you can start building some type of a system from there. Follow up this summer if it does turn wet, and look at the crop growth patterns. Like I said, it's going to show up much better in corn than it's going to show up in alfalfa most of the time. Very rarely are you going to see it in small grains or in pasture situations. And take some rainy days, some colder days here, and start flipping through some of those old air photos. Start digging around. What have you got in the file cabinet that maybe you got from ASCS or Farm Service Agency or NRCS or the county 10, 15 years ago that you meant to clean out and you never did? Because sometimes people have those old 1990s, 1980s air photos still sitting around. And then next time you're crop reporting or in the government office, ask them what they've got, both in the farm file, but also old air photos for the farm sites as well.
And sometimes it's just fun to look at those old photos and see how things have changed, but sometimes how much they've stayed the same in those time periods as well.
Definitely.
But Kevin, when we're thinking about that and maybe we're getting started and we're starting to find some indications that we've got some tile where we think it might be, what are some good software or mapping apps that really can help aid in this I don't want to say journey, but this long commitment it feels like some days.
Yeah, so I think that really depends on what the farmer or their consultant is already doing, because yeah, there's a plethora of different apps out there, different software packages, but I'm a big believer in, if you've already invested not only the dollars but the time to put your maps into that John Deere Operations Center environment or into ArcGIS, or your crop consultant has a program, use that. And if it does what you need it to do, don't spend the extra money, don't reinvent the wheel. But yeah, have a conversation with your consultant, ask them what they've got, what they're using. They may charge you for this service. I think they should, because it's time and effort on their part, but they may also have other insight and be able to meld in some of the yield map data that maybe they have, for the farm, but also farm employees, when they're out there, tell them what to look for. Look for those tile blowouts. Look for those patterns of dryness in the field this time of year. Look for those differences in crop growth.
Okay. And then another question for you here. We've got the things to be thinking about of what we should do, but are there any common mistakes that you can help people kind of avoid as they're thinking about or looking into where some of this old drainage system might be, or maybe even just going forward and mapping here today that you've worked and found with others?
Yeah, so I think it's very easy when you start looking at this, like I pointed out on the 1930s air photo, to look at something and think, oh, that's drain tile, that makes sense. I always like to have at least 2 or 3 different maps or 2 or 3 different sources combined together. And so I will, when I'm doing this, I'll have different colors on here. Yep, I definitely think this is, and yeah, I'm suspicious this might be, but it might not be. And don't jump to conclusions either. And sometimes this is a multi-year process to build things together.
And I think that's the important thing to think here is it's not a quick and simple. I mean, at least from the way it sounds, there's lots of time when you got time. Like I said, we all know time's a luxury and it's sometimes easier said than done unless you're in a pinch of a situation. But I mean, if you have the time, like you were mentioning earlier about some of these photos from year to year, being able to take them and have those observations, it makes a big impact. But when we're also talking about this and looking at, the multiple different resources, if you had to rank, if you only had one or two that you would rely heavily on, what are the one or two resources from the photos, from the yield data maps, from the old Euchre and Budweiser method? What are some of the more reliable ones if you had to rank them and pick in order to start that would be the most useful if you are just in a pinch and need to get it done?
Yeah. So I always like to start with the things that are fun and easy to do. And so that's the way I am. So I really would start with those old air photos because you can start off with Google Earth and be able to flip through multiple years at one sitting. You get interrupted, you can come back and then start adding a few more to that. And then just when you're riding the fields, having that cell phone camera, taking a few photos, documenting things there. I think those are really the two lowest time involvement kind of things to start with. And then from there, you can build in, okay, I'm going to go into my old yield map files and see what I can do. But you really want to have your tile, at least an idea of where things are first before you start putting the yield map data in, because yield maps show a lot more things than drainage and soil moisture. There's compaction. There's where old fence rows were, which is a common mistake I see on yield mod. Oh, that area there is a lot higher yielding. Well, that's because that was an old fence row. And the organic matter is just naturally higher where that old fence used to be. So have that map where you think things are first, and then overlay multiple years worth of yield monitor data to see what you come up with.
So the next question I have here, and maybe this is one I should have started with rather than, kind of, on the tail end of things. But when we're thinking about, old drainage tile, and you mentioned it is important to fix it up, but if you're somebody who's happy with how your field's running, why is it important to be thinking about mapping, finding these old tile and drainage systems and really be thinking about how it impacts your farm?
So philosophies on tile have changed over the years. When I was growing up, 50, even 100 foot on centers was pretty common for grid tiling. And the data in some soils is saying it's economically viable as narrow as 25 feet apart. And so obviously that's based on your markets, your cropland value, your soils, a lot of other factors. So the philosophy on how much tile we need has changed. I think the other thing is that as we're getting into like last year, we had 2 droughts and a flooding season last year. We've got people beginning to think, well, can I put a shutoff valve on these tile systems and then actually keep some of that water in a drier time of the year and let it go later in the year? And you definitely can do that. We see people playing around with managed drainage. And even on fields with a little bit of slope, you can do some modifications to that existing system to have some check valves in there so that you can do that stair stepping of the water table up the slope a little bit. And so knowing where things are, I think, is important, because if you're looking at adapting some of these newer techniques and technologies, you may be able to take advantage of what you've got. But if you decide I'm just going to start over from scratch, knowing what's there can help you prevent a failure from not realizing that things are going to go a different direction across the landscape than you thought they were.
Well, Kevin, I have to say it's a lot of things to be thinking about, and there's so much opportunity and areas within this that can not only help farmers improve what's going on their farm field, but maybe even getting ahead of what could potentially be down the line in terms of weather conditions and everything else in that nature. But as we wrap up here today, what's one or two key takeaways that you want producers to be thinking about or actively doing after today's discussion?
I think it's very easy not to think about tile because it's there, it's buried, it's always working. And it's not until I'm seeing a wet spot and I'm already losing dozens or hundreds of bushels in that wet spot. Oh, I've got a problem. And by then it's really too late. And so knowing where the systems are can help you keep ahead on maintenance, to help make some of those management decisions and be prepared to be proactive to fix problems. But the other thing I said at the beginning, particularly for our dairy producers and even our swine producers, which is a more watery manure, we do occasionally see low solids content manure getting into drain tile. And so knowing where they are so you can block them off and deal with the situation can help keep your farm as being the lead story off of the 6 o'clock news.
I think those are some really good things to be thinking about, especially within the area of, how can we be proactive, but also how can we, do the best for our environment as well in that case. But with all that being said, Kevin, it's a pleasure to have you on and definitely enjoyed today's discussion. So thank you so much for your time here this afternoon.
Yep, and thank you for having me and have a safe spring.
Thank you very much. And I have to say thanks for those who watched and asked your questions, as well as those who are joining us after. We always appreciate you enjoying the Dairy Signal. If you're somebody who's wondering what is going on in the world of professional dairy producers, head over to our website. We've got a great list of upcoming programs, including Dairy's Visible Voice, as well as that very interesting tour to New Zealand next winter. I was going to say spring, but it's in winter next year. If you're looking for a place to get a little bit warmer next February, New Zealand's a place to go. And we've got that international tour available to those. And spots are filling up very fast. I think we're getting down there on seats and they're getting limited. So if you want to get in on that, now's the time to join for that one. But for now, thank you for joining us here today on the Dairy Signal, and we'll see you here tomorrow. Bye now.